Okay, hello, my name is An Ho Young or Bo Young An. Just before we get started, like everyone, I would like to start off with some quick thank yous. Of course, to Ellen Mueller, Kylie Van Note, Sam Calda, my mentor, who has been through a lot with me, my thesis committee, Magdalena Mora and Brian Brittigan, faculty, my family who is here today from Thailand and Korea, and my partner, my friends, my cohort, and all of you here today. So a little about me, I'm a visual storyteller who focuses on telling the stories of a multicultural identity through the practice of art making, translation, writing, and social practice. As an international artist of color born in Korea and raised in Thailand and practicing in the United States, my work live in spaces of foundational recognition of the colonial legacy where there has been a history of the erosion and erasure of the traditional. My creative practice of translation and interpretation of the lingual, cultural, and visual acts as a remediation of how historically undervalued community stories are told. My storytelling practice involves multiple layers of processes before the visual iteration is made for the larger audience. These processes of interpretation and introspection, in addition to social practices, takes place behind the scenes and then are selectively put on view for the audience. Either way, they are an essential part of the final outcome. And there's me eating noodles, which is part of my video project. So my themes in my works can be visualized as this like tree trunk spiral, as the spiral allows for fluidity between the themes as my works live among all of these topics, moving back and forth and between each other. At the center of the spiral is the intimate culture that is formed and evolves within a family. The spiral curls into a larger scope where my Korean heritage sits. As the spiral continues to expand, there's a theme of collectivist, Korean and Thai, and individualist, UK and US cultures that make up a big part of my upbringing. These are all encompassed by the idea of the internal mending and acknowledgement of the multiplicity of a multicultural upbringing. And through the process of internal and process-oriented mending, the end results are works that are celebrations of a multicultural identity. Okay, so next slide. My practice is a collaboration between past and present. I aim to uplift under-acknowledged artistic traditions, practices, and stories in a way that can be appreciated by an international audience. I use various media, illustration, painting, embroidery, video, and animation, and the aesthetics of pop and Eastern Asian art. And I tell the stories of a blended multicultural identity. My creative practice, teaching, and collaborative projects are ways of communicating ideas and issues that I see others relating to. I actively look for things that I wish I had when navigating my multicultural upbringing, especially through representation. My goal is to give voices to lesser known and appreciated stories, crafts, and processes. And Yinka Shanibari has been a big influence on the way I think about the multicultural identity and the visual translation of our stories. I relate to his dual existence as a Nigerian-born, appointed Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. So basically he is Nigerian-born British artist. He states about his MBE appointment, and I felt it was more useful to accept it than to refuse it. Maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but I think it's better to make an impact from within rather than from without. Shonibare further explains this with the analogy of himself being a Trojan horse to describe his practice in getting his art and making a name in the Western art institutions. He uses the Dutch or African So they have two names, wax fabric, to represent the convoluted history of British colonialism and its lasting impact today. On the top left is, so the ballet, on the top left is from his work Odile and Odette, which some of you may know are the protagonists and antagonists of the Swan Lake Ballet. And the piece on the right, which is titled The Swing After Fragonard, both challenge the white history of art through the use of the African wax fabric. One of my practice is my work in the fiber arts and mixed media. So a little background is the main love language in Korea is the acts of service. And it's basically where you show your love by doing something for someone you love. Some personal examples are my mother sewing a rip in my clothing, which happened way more often than it should have, and cooking nutritional meals, and my dad making his special beef porridge when we were sick. Growing up with within multiple cultures, and now what I realize as an understanding of the power dynamics of the culture subconsciously from a young age, I had a contentious relationship with my Korean heritage growing up. And now in this practice, the act of literally mending my relationship with my Korean heritage with needles and embroidery floss is an act of and a form of ritual activism, how I am practicing decolonization by telling the stories of my ancestors on my own terms, literally and figuratively. So these rituals in my creative works are formed through the act of going through the actions and the embodiment of the practice. And this rids the problem of the excess. In this case, the excess is the explanation of my works. This labor of explanation that many minorities have to do in the spaces they take up is not offered to the audience through these works. Because at times the visual works don't need excessive descriptions, nor do they need to be fully understood by the audience. The visual culture is presented to the audience and the interpretation is left to the viewers. Another project, or my project that does go through the labor and explores the theme in the spiral, is my current project of writing and illustrating a children's storybook based on a lesser known Korean folktale. I take the story I heard as a child, acknowledging the traditional practice of oral storytelling in my Korean household, and I translate, reinterpret, and transcribe it into English as well as visual language. So, can you see that? Is that not working? Oh, sorry.
We can
okay, see. Sorry. So that's the spiral that, if you forgot, was in the beginning. So for the accompanying visual elements, I take the memories of my childhood in the summer that I spent in the summers in the Korean countryside where my maternal grandmother lived. And she lived in a tiny shack on a small hill. And I also take from the national flora and fauna of Korea. I then translate and update the visual culture to appeal to an international audience. The task of interpretation here serves a larger purpose in which the story becomes accessible to the wider audience. The service of going through the labor of translation for the collective, the audience for this book, outweighs the labor of translation that comes with this project. This is the project I'm focusing on for my thesis work. And this is the work where most of my love and labor is going into. It is a transcription and celebration of my familial and cultural history and identity where I see the balance of my multicultural identity existing. And as I near the end of my presentation, I leave you with this quote by Mio Vetrini, a French-born Venezuelan poet, journalist, and scriptwriter. Each generation translates again and again, tirelessly bringing serious or joyful demystification. These purposeful selections of parts of my creative process that are either displayed to the audience or are obstructed is a process where I'm very deliberate and mindful of the fatigue that comes with the lingual and cultural translation and explanation. the visual culture that comes out of this process does the work without the added labor, but at times it does show the work with all the love, sweat, and tears and labor, because we are all allowed to embrace and celebrate the plurality of our identities. 감사합니다. Thank you and khopkunka. And I will start taking questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bo. And yes, while people gather their thoughts and put questions into, already we've got a question. Awesome. All right. Jordan asks, awesome job. Can you talk more about how and why you chose embroidery?
Yeah, thank you. I chose embroidery because I kind of started it as part of like when the pandemic hit. Me and my sister had to go live with my parents because our lease was up and we were both moving out of the country. And then one of the last moments I had with my mom was her sewing this piece of like my winter, but not appropriate for Minnesota winter coat. And I thought that was such a intimate moment. And it's like something that really remained in my memories before I left. Thank you, Jordan.
All right. And Anna asks, hi, Bo. I love seeing these illustrative tiger motifs represented through fiber work. Do you foresee your current ongoing work to utilize fiber work in the near future?
I didn't expect to, but I do, because I am currently working on big, like 6-7 feet poly tabs that I'm embroidering, and they are of tigers. And I do use the tiger motif because it is a symbol of Korea. So the Korean map sideways, and if you squint, kind of looks like a tiger. It's in a lot of our folk tales, and it's also a very symbolic element of, and also is a guardian of the mountains. Yeah, thank you.
And next up, we have a question from Shoshana, who asks, you mentioned how acts of service are important in Korean culture. How does this figure into your work?
So I think for me, this transcription of this story is an act of service for me back to my family, because it's something I heard my mom telling me growing up, and with everything my family has done for me up until now, I think it's kind of like a love letter back to them, if I ever finish it. Yeah. Thank you, Shoshana.
And then we have a question from Yuan. Love your works, Bo. And I am also curious about what difficulties have you encountered, or what difficulties are you most worried about when producing cross-cultural works?
I think the most difficulty I had was the internal and personal processes that I had to go to even acknowledge, like, because I feel like growing up, I didn't really understand the power dynamics that, like, you know, going to an international school outside of the United States, it was still so Western, and it was considered, and is still considered, the best. So I think it's this, like, me having to kind of go so deep into like history and culture and how I got to the United States today. And just acknowledging that I didn't know what I was doing growing up. Like, am I Thai? Am I Korean? Am I American? No, I haven't been there yet. So not really. And I think it's still a difficulty, but I think I found a way to slowly process it through my creative practice.
Wonderful. And we've got one last question here. Anna asks, you mentioned at one point that you grew to have this contentious relationship with Korean culture, and that led you to your work in the program. Have you found that your current and fairly recent work has helped mend this personal perception for you?
Yes, absolutely. I think this contentious relationship, I don't think I guess it was personal too, but it was also like such an institutional and societal thing that I don't know if we can ever unpack fully, but I think, and that's why I start with the family at the core, because I'm not trying to fix cultural identity crises, but so I want to go from my own experiences first. And I think that's the first step into understanding this like multiplicity of being and cultures.
Awesome. What a great note to end on. Thank you, Bo. Everyone, let's give Bo a round of applause. Yay. Okay.